The earlier simple EHR design post suggests that a basic electronic health record needs at minimum a home screen where you select the patient of interest and a patient file where the actual patient information is displayed and captured. This post will discuss the patient file in more detail. And I guess the question to start would be, why not use the term patient chart? Patient chart seems more familiar, isn't it? Well, in paper-based systems, the term patient chart is that bundle of paper on the patient. In a hospital, it's the bundle of paperwork for their hospitalization. In a clinic, it's the bundle of clinical paperwork. And so, using this analogy in some ways, the patient chart represents the end store of data about a patient. And I agree with this. But we have to realize this end store of patient information is reasonably static. Once it's recorded into the patient chart, it's there really forever. And I would like to mentally separate this process of how information gets into the patient chart, which is a very dynamic process involving different forms and papers, versus the actual patient chart itself, more of that end store of patient information. And so that's kind of why I'm proposing the use of the term patient chart to represent the reasonably static end store of patient information, and then using a different term, patient workflow, to represent the dynamic process of how information is captured, interacted with, and used during unique clinical situations. And so we need a term which isn't patient chart and isn't patient workflow, which encompasses both of these concepts. And that's what the term patient file is. Patient file is the highest level of the hierarchy, and underneath it you have things such as a patient chart and a patient workflow. So let's look at the patient chart a little bit more. It's this enduring and broadly similar characteristics would be its two main features. This end store of patient information, the generic patient chart, is reasonably similar across many care settings around the world. Many different clinics or hospitals, for instance, could function really by accessing a generic patient chart designed with the same general layout. And the reality is that most paper-based charts pretty much look the same. And so ideally, this patient chart will be designed using the absolute best practices in information display. It should be designed with a focus on patient safety, a focus on speed of information retrieval and information communication to the user, and to be applicable across many different care settings and users. Now, I realize, of course, this one chart suits all approach may not always work. There are certainly subspecialty clinics that like to create a shadow chart where they display and sort information in a unique way, or for instance units such as the ICU, which have unique data summary pages, or specific charts for specific types of clinicians. But at times a special chart may be required, but I would think that this is more of an adding on to the existing structure of the generic patient chart. It's adding in a certain amount of specialization. It's not really a whole reimagining of the patient chart from scratch. And we'll talk about in a separate post a way which you can dynamically change the generic patient chart to apply to specific situations. And that's kind of a concept called the magic chart, but that's for a subsequent post. Separate from this enduring and broadly similar concept of the patient chart is the patient workflow. And this is the opposite because the patient workflow should be considered something which is highly unique, highly variable, very transient. Really, each organization, each user, each clinic likely has its own workflows. And these workflows change between a patient's circumstances, between your supply chain circumstances, and workflows are really hard to transfer across organizations or even reuse within the same organization. And so because the workflow section of the patient file is so highly variable, we have to assume really from day one that we need to be able to give an organization tools to be able to build and edit their own workflows. And so how does this all apply to building an EHR? Well, we've discussed this concept of the patient file, which is the part of the electronic health record where information about a single patient is displayed and captured. And within that patient file, we have the patient chart and the patient workflow. The patient chart is that section which is probably could be similar across an organization or even across multiple organizations, whereas the workflow is the part which needs to be highly specific based on context. And so if we're thinking about what we need to design a patient chart which really follows best practices and is highly generalizable. And we need to design tools to enable an organization to go in and build a workflow from scratch. Well, just one quick comment at the close here on EHR composability. This article doesn't suggest that I don't think organizations should go in and build their own unique patient charts. As I said, there'll be a post in the future which discusses some ways which I think you can do this automatically. It's just to provide really a simple framework to suggest if you were going to put your energy into one part of composability within an EHR, you probably want to initially put your energy into building a very effective workflow manager for that medical record, and you could probably allow the patient chart to be reasonably reused throughout the organization. Perhaps in the distant future, after the workflow section is functioning very well, additional efforts could be put into composability and customization of the patient chart section, but I think that could be delayed as a later decision.